Lecture 1, Cognitive Discursive Paradigm, Communicative Linguistics, Cognitive Linguistics. Human language, that unique characteristic of our species, has been of interest throughout history. The scientific study of human language is called linguistics. A linguist is a scientist who investigates human language in all its facets, its structure, its use, its history, its place in society. There are different directions of the linguistic research. Theoretical linguistics, often referred to as generative linguistics, has its basis in views first put forth by Chomsky's 1955 The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory. In the book The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory and the subsequent books and articles by Chomsky and those that embraced these views, a major aim was to characterize the nature of human linguistic knowledge or competence, represented in the mind as a mental grammar, that is, to explain or account for what speakers know, which permits them to speak and comprehend speech or sign. The production and comprehension of speech is referred to as performance, distinct from the competence but dependent on it. Descriptive linguistics provides analysis of the grammars of languages such as Choctaw, Arabic, Zulu, Indo-European linguistics, Romance linguistics, African linguistics refer to the studies of particular languages and language families from both historical and synchronic points of view. Historical linguistics is concerned with the theory of language change, why and how languages develop. The comparative method, developed in the 19th century by such philologists as the brothers Grimm and Hermann Pohl, is a method used to compare languages in the attempt to determine which languages are related and to establish families of languages and their roots. Anthropological or ethnolinguistics or sociolinguistics focus on languages as part of culture and society, including language and culture, social class, ethnicity, and gender. Dialectology investigates how these factors fragment one language into many. In addition, sociolinguistics and applied linguistics are interested in language planning, literacy, bilingualism, and second language acquisition. Applied linguistics also covers such areas as discourse and conversational analysis, language assessment, language pedagogy. Computational linguistics is concerned with natural language computer applications, e.g. automatic parsing, machine processing and understanding, computer stimulation of grammatical modules for the generation and parsing of sentences. If viewed as a branch of artificial intelligence, computational linguistics has the goal of modeling human language as a cognitive system. Mathematical linguistics studies the formal and mathematical properties of language. Pragmatics studies language in context and the influence of situation on meaning. Communicative linguistics is a direction in modern linguistics that considers speech acts, statement, request, question, etc. as a unit of communication. The communicative significance of the structural elements of which words, phrases, sentences is manifested in coherent text, discourse. The interest of researchers in this area of linguistics meant a certain revision of the attitude to popular in the 50s and 60s structural and transformational generative directions in linguistics, which did not give the expected results in improving the practical level of proficiency in a non-native language. The emergence of communicative linguistics characterized a new stage in the development of modern language science. Describing pre-communication linguistics, Kolchinsky states, of course, linguistics since its formation as an independent science has always been involved in semantics of language units, initially with the main emphasis on the semantics of words, lexicography, late in the semantics of statements, the semantics of the grammatical forms, and then especially the semantics of sentences, syntax semantics, and at last semantics of the text linguistics. However, this work was carried out as a rule in the field of semantics of independent units in isolation, semantics of individual words, individual forms, individual types of sentences. Some scholars explain the rapid development of communicative linguistics also by the fact that at the present stage it is no longer possible to obtain major results in the field of traditional pragmatic linguistics. The main features inherent in various areas of communicative linguistics, which in the last decade has become a special section of linguistics, are analysis of language units in the context of specific communicative acts and consideration of the utterance text as a starting point for the linguistic analysis. The communicative direction in linguistics, which is now widely used, differs from the functional one. The term functional linguistics refers to several different areas: the study of the language functioning features in different extra-linguistic situations, that is, business communication, production, game, training, etc. It is the study of the features how the language performs its individual functions: communicative, expressive, appellative, visual, aesthetic, etc. It is also the research in the field of functional semantic categories. Communicative linguistics differs from the listed varieties of the functional approach as it always analyzes specific language units under the conditions of a certain communicative act, examines the differences in the functioning of language units in various communicative conditions. Neurolinguistics is concerned with the biological basis of language acquisition and development and the brain-mind-language interface. It brings linguistic theory to bear on research on aphasia, language disorders following brain injury, and research involving the latest technologies in the study of brain imaging and processing. Psycholinguistics is the branch of linguistics concerned with linguistic performance, the production and comprehension of speech or sign. An area of psycholinguistics, which in some ways is a field in its own, is child language acquisition, how children acquire their complex grammar which underlies language use. This is a subject of major concern, particularly because of the interest in the biology of language. The interest in the nature of human language appears to have arisen when the human species evolved in the history of time. There is no culture that has left records that do not reveal either philosophical or practical concerns for this unique human characteristic. Different historical periods reveal different emphasis and different goals, although both interests have existed in parallel. Egyptian surgeons were concerned with clinical questions. An Egyptian papyrus dated 1700 BCE includes medical descriptions of language disorders following brain injury. The philosophers of ancient Greece, on the other hand, argued and debated questions dealing with the origin and the nature of language. Plato, writing between 427 and 348 BCE, devoted his Cratylus dialogue to linguistic issues of the day, and Aristotle was concerned with the language from both rhetorical and philosophical points of view. The Greeks and Romans also wrote grammars and discussed the sounds of language and the structures of words and sentences. This interest continued through the medieval period and the Renaissance in an unbroken thread to the present period. Linguistic scholarship, however, was not confined to Europe. In India, the Sanskrit language was the subject of detailed analysis as early as the 20th century BCE. Panini's Sanskrit grammar, dated ca. 500 BCE, is still considered to be one of the greatest scholarly linguistic achievements. In addition, Chinese and Arabic scholars have all contributed to our understanding of human language. The major efforts of the linguists of the 19th century were devoted to the historical and comparative studies. Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist in this tradition, turned his attention instead to the structural principles of language rather than to the ways in which language change and develop, and in doing so became a major influence of the 20th century linguistics. In Europe and America, linguists turned to descriptive synchronic studies of languages and to the development of empirical methods for their analysis. Scholars from different disciplines and with different interests turned their attention to the many aspects of language and language use. American linguists in the first half of the 20th century included the anthropologist Edward Sapir, interested in the languages of the Americans, language and culture, and language in society, and Leonard Bloomfield, himself an historical and comparative linguist, as well as a major descriptive linguist, who emerged as the most influential linguist in this period. Both Sapir and Bloomfield were also concerned with the developing of general theory of language. Sapir was a mentalist, in that he believed that any viable linguistic theory must account for the mental representation of linguistic knowledge, its psychological reality. Bloomfield, in his later years, was the follower of the behaviorism, which was the mainstream of psychological thought at the time, a view that precluded any concern for mental representation of language and, in fact, for the mind itself. In Europe, Roman Jakobson, one of the founders of the Prague School of Linguistics, came to America in 1941 and contributed substantially to the new developments in the field. His collaboration with Maurice Halley and Garner Fant led to the theory of distinctive features in phonology, and Halley has remained one of the leading phonologists of last decade. In England, phoneticians like Daniel Jones and Henry Sweet have had a lasting influence on the study of the sound systems of language. In 1957, with the publication of Syntactic Structures, Noam Chomsky ushered in the area of generative grammar, a theory which has been referred to as creating a scientific revolution. The theory of grammar has developed in depth and breadth. It is concerned with the biological basis of the acquisition, representation, and use of human language and the universal principles which constrain the class of all languages. It seeks to construct a scientific theory that is explicit and explanatory. The great development in linguistic theory has occurred since the publication of Syntactic Structures in 1957 and Aspects of the Theory of Syntax in 1965. In subsequent years, Chomsky has continued to develop his theory in such major works as Remarks on Nominalization, 1970, Conditions and Transformations, 1973, Lectures on Government and Binding, 1981, Barriers, 1986, Principles and Parameters in Syntactic Theory, 1981, and the Minimalist Program, 1995. Aims of linguistic theory. There are three questions posed by Chomsky in 1986 which remain pivotal in linguistics today. What constitutes knowledge of language? Competence. How is knowledge of language acquired? Acquisition. How is knowledge of language put to use? Performance, language processing. In the past decade, cognitive linguistics has developed into one of the most dynamic and attractive frameworks within theoretical and descriptive linguistics. Cognitive linguistics is an approach to the analysis of natural language that originated in the late 70s and early 80s in the work of George Lakoff, Ron Lenkaka, and Len Tommy, and that focuses on language as an instrument for organizing, processing, and conveying information. Given this perspective, the analysis of the conceptual and experiential basis of linguistic categories is of primary importance within cognitive linguistics. The formal structures of language are studied not as if they were autonomous, but as reflection of general conceptual organization, categorization principles, processing mechanisms, and experiential and environmental influences. Because cognitive linguistics sees language as embedded in the overall cognitive capacities of men, topics of special interest for cognitive linguistics include the structural characteristics of natural language categorization, such as prototypicality, systematic polysemy, cognitive models, mental imagery, and metaphor. The functional principles of linguistic organization, such as iconicity and naturalness, the conceptual interface between syntax and semantics, as explored by cognitive grammar and construction grammar, the experiential and pragmatic background of language in use, and the relationship between language and thought, including questions about relativism and conceptual universals. Crucially, there is no single uniform doctrine according to which these research topics are pursued by cognitive linguistics. In this sense, cognitive linguistics is a flexible framework rather than a single theory of language. In terms of category structure, one of the standard topics for analysis in cognitive linguistics, we might say that cognitive linguistics itself, when viewed as a category, has a family resemblance structure. It constitutes a cluster of many partially overlapping approaches rather than a single, well-defined theory. Cognitive linguistics is the study of language in its cognitive function, where cognitive refers to the crucial role of the intermediate informational structures in our encounters with the world. Cognitive linguistics is cognitive in the same way that cognitive psychology is, by assuming that our interaction with the world is mediated through informational structures in the mind. It is more specific than cognitive psychology, however, by focusing on natural language as a means for organizing, processing, and conveying that information. Language, then, is seen as a repository of world knowledge, a structured collection of meaningful categories that help us deal with new experiences and store information about old ones. From this overall characterization, three fundamental characteristics of cognitive linguistics can be derived. the primacy of semantics in linguistic analysis, the encyclopedic nature of linguistic meaning, and the perspectival nature of linguistic meaning. The first characteristic merely states that the basic function of language involves meaning. The other two characteristics specify the nature of the semantic phenomena in question. The primacy of semantics in linguistic analysis follows in a straightforward fashion from the cognitive perspective itself. If the primary function of language is categorization, then meaning must be the primary linguistic phenomenon. The encyclopedic nature of linguistic meaning follows from the categorical function of language. If language is a system for the categorization of the world, there is no need to postulate a systematic or structural level of linguistic meaning that is different from the level where world knowledge is associated with linguistic forms. The perspectival nature of linguistic meaning implies that the world is not objectively reflected in the language. The categorization function of the language imposes a structure on the world rather than just mirroring objective reality. Specifically, language is a way of organizing knowledge that reflects the needs, interests, and experiences of individuals and cultures. The idea that linguistic meaning has a perspectivalizing function is theoretically elaborated in the philosophical, epistemological positions taken by the cognitive linguistics. The experientialist position of cognitive linguistics vis-à-vis human knowledge emphasizes the view that human reason is determined by our organic embodiment and by our individual and collective experiences. Cognitive linguistics argues that language is governed by general cognitive principles rather than by special purpose language module. The following three major hypotheses are seen as guiding the cognitive linguistic approach to language. Language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty. Grammar is conceptualization. Knowledge of language emerges from language use. The first hypothesis is that language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty. The basic corollary of this hypothesis is that the representation of linguistic knowledge is essentially the same as the representation of other conceptual structures, and that the processes in which that knowledge is used are not fundamentally different from cognitive abilities that human beings use outside the domain of language. The first corollary is essentially that linguistic knowledge, the knowledge of meaning and form, is basically conceptual structure. It is probably not difficult to accept the hypothesis that semantic representation is basically conceptual, but cognitive linguists argue that syntactic, morphological, and phonological representation is also basically conceptual. This might appear counterintuitive at first. Sounds are physical entities, and ultimately so are utterances and their formal structure. But sounds and utterances must be comprehended and produced, and both of those processes involve the mind. Sounds and utterances are the input and output of cognitive processes that govern speaking and understanding. The second corollary is that the cognitive processes that govern language use, in particular the construction and communication of meaning by language, are in principle the same as other cognitive abilities. That is, the organization and retrieval of linguistic knowledge is not significantly different from the organization and retrieval of other knowledge in the mind, and the cognitive abilities that we apply to speaking and understanding language are not significantly different from those applied to other cognitive tasks, such as visual perception, reasoning, or motor activity. Language is a distinct human cognitive ability, to be sure. From a cognitive perspective, language is the real-time perception and production of a temporal sequence of discrete, structured, symbolic units. This particular configuration of cognitive abilities is probably unique to language, but the component cognitive skills required are not. The hypothesis that language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty has had two major implications for cognitive linguistic research. Much cognitive linguistic research has been devoted to elucidating conceptual structure and cognitive abilities as they are seen to apply to language, in the effort to demonstrate that language can be adequately modeled using just these general conceptual structures and cognitive abilities. Second, cognitive linguists appeal to, at least in principle, to models in cognitive psychology, in particular models of memory, perception, attention, and categorization. Psychological models of memory have inspired linguistic models of the organization of linguistic knowledge into frames, domains, and grammatical knowledge in networks linked by taxonomic and other relations. Psychological models of attention and perception, especially Gestalt psychology, have led to the explication of many conceptualization processes in semantics. Finally, psychological models of categorization, in particular prototypes and graded centrality, and more recent models of category structure have had perhaps the greatest influence on both semantic and grammatical category analysis in cognitive linguistics. The second major hypothesis of the cognitive linguistic approach is embodied in Langacker's slogan, "Grammar is conceptualization." This slogan refers to a more specific hypothesis about conceptual structure, namely that conceptual structure cannot be reduced to a simple truth-conditional correspondence with the world. A major aspect of human cognitive ability is the conceptualization of the experience to be communicated, also the conceptualization of the linguistic knowledge we possess. The third major hypothesis of the cognitive linguistic approach is that knowledge of language emerges from language use, that is, categories and structures in semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology are built up from our cognition of specific utterances on specific occasions of use. This inductive process of abstraction and schematization does not lose the conventionalized subtleties and differences found among even highly specific grammatical constructions and word meanings.